Before you get started with SharePoint, there are some administration basics you should be aware of first. Microsoft calls SharePoint an application delivery platform. In that sense, it isn't a turnkey product in the same way as Exchange Server or Microsoft Word. SharePoint is more like a collection of parts that you install and configure to address specific needs. That flexibility makes SharePoint scalable for a wide range of organizations and uses. But it also makes it difficult for administrators to understand. IT professionals are used to wearing a lot of hats, but it can get a little crazy with SharePoint. It helps to break SharePoint down a little with an overview from an administrator standpoint. You need to look at 3 key areas. Hardware, your physical topology. Software, the required technologies that are needed to support the SharePoint environment. And of course the skill set, the administrative roles. You may find that you have different levels of roles depending on the size of your organization and your farm. SharePoint can reside on 1 or more physical servers, and more likely you will have more than one SharePoint server in your farm. Server farms. Microsoft refers to SharePoint as residing on server farms, which are much the same as sets of Windows 2008 servers that are part of the same local area network. An organization that requires greater performance would use 1 or more dedicated web front ends, and these are referred to as WFEs. They handle the user's requests in a timely manner and render the pages requested. User requests are routed by a load balancer such as a Microsoft Internet Service Accelerator, ISA, and some of the services are offloaded to additional servers to improve performance. It is important to realize that all the data is stored in a SQL backend. When a user requests a site, it's actually being pulled from the database. SQL Server holds all of the websites, lists, libraries, personalization data, etc. that users see when they use SharePoint. This means that you can scale up by adding additional WFEs or SQL servers. This scaling is possible because SharePoint uses a service-oriented architecture. That's a buzzword. In practice, it means that SharePoint is just a collection of services that can run on different machines if needed. This is an image of a typical LAN without SharePoint. We have our web server, Exchange, the database backend, your DC, domain controller, and other services, file shares, and backups. Notice that they're all separate and not intertwined. Here's an image of a SharePoint server in a LAN. When you look at this image, you'll notice that SharePoint is in the center of all of the different services. You have Exchange Server, which is going to handle the incoming and outgoing email for SharePoint. You also have your SQL backend database. That's where everything's going to be stored. All your content that's stored in SharePoint is actually not stored on the server of SharePoint. It's stored in the SQL database. And then you have the domain controller, AD, handling the user authentication. And of course you have file shares and backup. And SharePoint is capable of searching and indexing your file shares. So if you're in SharePoint and you search for a document that is stored out on your file share, as long as it's been set up that way, it'll render the results in SharePoint, so you can easily get to it. Now let's take it a little bit closer into SharePoint. Here we have a standard SharePoint server farm. You have 2 WFEs rendering websites to the users. It handles the requests that the users make. And then you also have central administration that is doing the search and indexing to provide the results in the indexes to the WFEs, the web front ends. It also is going to be your central administration, where you're going to go to manage your farm. You have the load balancer on the upper left corner. When a user makes a request, it's going to hit the load balancer. The load balancer is then going to route that request to a particular server depending on what rules you have set up. Whether it's going to be round robin, least connections, it just depends on how your organization's policies are set. Required technologies. First, you need to know that SharePoint is not a single entity. When you say SharePoint, you're really talking about one of the following products: Microsoft SharePoint 2010 Foundation, WSS4. This is free, no licensing is required. You can download it from the internet, install it on your server. You're not going to get all the functionality that you would get with SharePoint Server, but it does do quite a bit. And for a small environment, that's perfectly fine. You also have SharePoint 2010 Intranet and Internet versions. You have 2010 Server, comes with 2 editions, Standard and Enterprise. Enterprise is going to have all of the features that are available. Standard's going to have quite a few. It's going to have more than Foundation, but not quite as much as Enterprise. And if the search that SharePoint offers out of the box isn't enough for your organization, you also have Enterprise Fast Search. And then there are versions specific to online, and that would be Standard and Dedicated. The licensing for these different technologies do tend to change, so make sure you speak with your Microsoft representative to get the most current information. SharePoint Online versions are kind of unique to 2010. They are cloud versions of SharePoint hosted by Microsoft. This eliminates the need to build and maintain the hardware and farm. There are 2 online versions, the Standard and the Dedicated, and if you go to their website, you can get additional information. Just remember, Foundation is the core technology that all the related products use. Foundation, no matter what version you're using, is going to be running on SharePoint. And then the SharePoint Server version, Standard and Enterprise, sit on top of SharePoint Foundation. And remember, if you do decide to just go with SharePoint Foundation, you can do a lot with it alone. In fact, it's a fantastic value for small businesses. SharePoint Server is a superset of Foundation, so many skills you learn in Foundation you reuse in SharePoint Server. And most businesses that are looking for SharePoint administrators expect you to know both. SharePoint is based on Foundation, and Foundation is based on ASP.NET and other Microsoft technologies. Let's take a peek at that. Here are some additional Windows services that SharePoint relies on. You have SharePoint Foundation, ASP.NET 2.0, of course .NET, Microsoft IIS, SMTP service for email capabilities, Active Directory to authenticate your users, DNS, so when someone types in that address, it knows where to go. You have MMC, Perfmon, and SCOM. SCOM is an additional tool that Microsoft offers to monitor your servers, and they have specific management packs for SharePoint. SharePoint also relies on these products. SQL Server, there is no SharePoint with SQL Server. Simple as that. It does not work, it does not run, it must have SQL Server installed. On the client side, Internet Explorer and Microsoft Office. And it is important to try to keep these consistent. If you're running one version, if you're running IE8, you want to make sure that it's consistent throughout your organization. Although that may not always be the case, there may be some exceptions. You may have another business application that won't run on IE8. So these are things you need to take into consideration and validate beforehand. And remember, if you're running different versions, it makes it a little bit more complicated to manage. Some of the administrative roles at the different stages of the project are deployment. The key services are SharePoint, DNS, Active Directory, IIS, SMTP, and SQL. And to go along with the deployment role are some key tasks. Write a deployment plan, configure the server, install SharePoint, configure SharePoint, set up your services, and schedule backups. The next role is rollout. The key services associated with rollout are SharePoint, Active Directory, ASP.NET, Perfmon. And then the key tasks associated with the rollout role are setting up security groups, create client policies, brand the intranet, create initial SharePoint sites, review and test, and of course, monitor the server. The next role is server support. The key services, SharePoint, Perfmon, Process Explorer, SCOM, SQL, and if you're using Kerberos Deleg Config, it's a tool provided by Microsoft to help troubleshoot any Kerberos authentication issues you may have. The key tasks associated with this: create sites, lists, and libraries, create the templates that you're going to provide for the users, manage site quotas, mail enable libraries, restore from backups, and archiving sites. And then finally, desktop support. And the services for that are SharePoint, Internet Explorer, and Office. And the tasks are train the users. The more prepared your users are, the better the adoption will be for SharePoint. Troubleshoot client access and manage security.